I speak now from the stillness of Bollingen, where the stones remember more than men do, and where the lake reflects not only the sky, but the unfinished work of the soul. You who call yourself an empath have already traveled far, though you may not yet recognize the distance. You have crossed deserts of feeling, borne the grief of others as if it were your own blood. Learn to read the slightest tremor in a human voice, as if it were a seismic warning. And yet you stand before a final threshold, a gate older than morality, older than compassion itself. And here most of your kind falter not from weakness, but from a loyalty that has outlived its purpose. You have been taught subtly and repeatedly that your sensitivity is a calling only if it is spent outward. From childhood onward, the psyche of the empath is shaped by an unspoken commandment. Feel more, carry more, understand more, but ask for less. This commandment does not arrive as a voice. It descends like a climate. Long before you had language for it, you learned that harmony depended on your vigilance, that peace required your adaptation, that love was secured by your capacity to absorb what others could not bear. In the early years of life, this adaptation is not a pathology but a necessity. The child who feels too much in a fractured environment survives by becoming a vessel. But what once preserved life can later obstruct it in the same way that scaffolding left in place will prevent the completion of a cathedral. Here begins the negrado, the blackening. Though many empaths mistake it for virtue, you believe that endurance is maturity, that silence is wisdom, that restraint is spiritual authority. Yet beneath this polished surface, something in you has begun to rot, not morally, but alchemically. It is a rot of unused fire. The psyche cannot indefinitely repress its own center without consequences. What you experience as exhaustion, as a sense of invisibility, as a quiet resentment you do not permit yourself to name, is the first smoke rising from the furnace. You may call it burnout, spiritual fatigue, or loss of faith. But these are merely contemporary labels for an ancient process, the soul withdrawing its energy from false forms. If you listen carefully, you will notice that this withdrawal does not feel dramatic. It is not a crisis that announces itself with thunder. It arrives more like winter light, pale and shortened, touching fewer things each day. The empath discovers that the gestures which once brought meaning now feel hollow, that acts of care are performed without inner assent, that the old emotional reflexes continue while the soul itself has stepped back. This is the psyche preparing you for the last gate. Though you may still believe you are failing, rather than being summoned to understand why this gate terrifies the empath, one must speak of authority, not the kind granted by institutions, nor the counterfeit authority of dominance, but the authority that arises when the self no longer negotiates with its own fragmentation. True spiritual authority is not an ornament placed upon a personality. It is a gravitational field that reorganizes the psyche around its center. And here lies the conflict. The empath's identity has been built upon relational orbiting. You have defined yourself through attunement, responsiveness, and moral consideration. Authority, by contrast, demands a capacity to stand alone without apology, to allow others to experience the consequences of their own unconsciousness without intervention. This feels to the empath like betrayal. Consider the myth of Orpheus, who could move stones and soften the hearts of gods with his music, yet failed at the final moment because he could not resist turning back. His descent into the underworld was successful. His return was not. Why? Because the last instruction violated his deepest emotional habit. He was permitted to lead Eurydice out of darkness, but forbidden to reassure himself through contact. The empath tragedy is similar. You are capable of descending into the pain of others, of navigating chaos and shadow, but you hesitate when asked to relinquish the need to be needed, the need to confirm connection through sacrifice. The last gate does not bar your compassion. It tests whether your compassion can survive without self-erasure. In the alchemical texts, the negrad is often accompanied by images of dismemberment of bodies, broken down into indistinguishable matter. Psychologically, this corresponds to the collapse of roles that once gave structure to the personality. For the empath, this collapse often takes the form of relational disillusionment. You begin to see perhaps for the first time that your giving has not always healed, that your understanding has sometimes enabled stagnation, that your silence has preserved dysfunction. This realization is unbearable if approached morally, but necessary if approached symbolically. The soul is not accusing you. It is reclaiming itself. At this stage, many empaths retreat. They seek spiritual systems that reaffirm their sacrifice, philosophies that romanticize selflessness, or psychological narratives that frame their exhaustion as proof of higher consciousness. These are not false teachings but incomplete ones. They soothe the ego at the very moment it must be dismantled. The last gate cannot be passed by moral superiority, nor by suffering endured in the name of love. It requires a colder courage, the willingness to disappoint, to be misunderstood, to let the world rearrange itself without your constant mediation. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Em. If the heart was heavier, burdened by excess, the soul could not proceed. What is rarely noted is that heaviness does not come only from sin, but from attachment. The empath's heart is often heavy not with malice but with unreturned responsibilities, with identities formed around others needs to pass the gate. The heart must be light, not empty, but unencumbered. This is not achieved by becoming less sensitive, but by withdrawing projections, by recognizing where your sense of purpose has been entangled with the avoidance of your own center. Here the psyche shifts toward a Leo, the whitening, though it does not yet feel like clarity. Instead, there is a strange emotional cooling, a detachment that frightens those who have known you as endlessly available. You may fear that you are becoming cruel, indifferent, or spiritually dead. In truth, you are learning the difference between empathy and fusion. The soul begins to wash itself free of compulsive identification, much like moonlight, revealing contours that daylight obscured. This phase often brings vivid dreams, images of empty houses, abandoned temples, or solitary journeys across water. These are not symbols of loss but of ownership returning to its rightful place. Yet even here many stop short. They taste the relief of withdrawal but refuse its completion. They remain half in, half out, oscillating between boundaries and guilt, solitude and longing. The last gate requires decisiveness, not in action but in allegiance. You must choose whether your highest loyalty is to harmony or to truth. This choice is never announced as such. It appears instead as a series of small refusals, moments when you do not explain yourself, do not rescue, do not soften a necessary tension. Each of these moments feels like a violation of your nature, yet together they constitute its maturation. Gnostic myths speak of the soul descending through spheres ruled by archons, each demanding identification to pass. The soul must answer not with compliance but with remembrance, knowledge of its origin beyond the system. Psychologically, the empath archons are internalized voices, the good child, the healer, the one who understands. They demand tribute in the form of continued self-sacrifice. The last gate is guarded by the most persuasive of these voices, because it wears your own face. It asks, who will you be if you are no longer defined by your usefulness? The terror you feel before this question is not fear of emptiness, but fear of sovereignty. Ruedo the reigning does not arrive as bliss. It arrives as embodiment. The self takes its place not above life, but within it, coloring perception with a quiet authority that no longer seeks validation. When an empath reaches this stage, others may accuse them of changing, of becoming distant, of losing their light. In reality, the light has condensed. It no longer spills indiscriminately. It radiates. This is the difference between warmth that dissipates and fire that transforms. But to reach this, you must pass the last gate without witnesses. No one can applaud this crossing because it often looks like withdrawal, refusal, or even failure from the outside. The psyche understands, though, and it will reorganize itself around this new center with a precision that feels almost fated. Relationships will either deepen or dissolve. Work will either align or lose meaning. What remains will be fewer but real. I tell you this not to persuade, but to name what is already happening. The gate stands before you whether you acknowledge it or not. To stop short is not a moral failing. It is simply a choice to remain in service to an identity that once saved you but can no longer sustain you. Yet if you feel a quiet pressure behind the sternum, a sense that your old ways no longer answer the questions life is asking, then the work has begun. This is not the end of compassion. It is its liberation from compulsion. When the empath passes the last gate, they do not become less human. They become more particular, more exact, more aligned with the rhythm of their own depths. Authority in this sense is not power over others, but fidelity to the self that no longer fragments itself to belong. The lake outside my window does not rush toward its own reflection, and yet it holds the sky with unwavering fidelity. In this it mirrors the stage of the work you now approach, where movement becomes subtle, and the soul learns that stillness itself can be an act of authority. You have already felt the initial severing, the quiet withdrawal of energy from roles that once defined you. Now the psyche asks a more demanding question, one that does not concern what you do for others, but what remains when the reflex to give has been consciously restrained. At this point, the empath often encounters a peculiar emptiness, not the despair of loss, but a hollowing out that feels almost sacrilegious. You may notice stretches of time where no urgent emotional signals arise, where the inner atmosphere is strangely neutral, neither warm nor cold. This neutrality is frequently misinterpreted as spiritual failure. Yet, it is in fact the psyche suspending its habitual reactions so that a deeper orientation can emerge. The alchemists warned that during albedo, the adept might believe the work has died because the black smoke has cleared and the fire no longer roars. But what has ceased is not life, only noise. It is here that the shadow of the empath reveals its most refined disguise. No longer appearing as overt self-sacrifice, it now speaks in the language of ethics and subtle superiority. A voice arises that says, "I could intervene, but I am choosing restraint. I could help, but I am being spiritually mature." This voice is dangerous, not because it is malicious, but because it converts necessity into virtue. The last gate does not open to those who perform detachment as a moral posture. It opens only when detachment becomes unavoidable, when the soul no longer has the energy to pretend that it can carry what does not belong to it. In Greek myth, Hermes is the Cyclope, the guide between worlds. Yet he does not carry the dead on his back. He walks ahead, indicating the path. But each soul must move under its own weight. The empath accustomed to bearing others across thresholds must learn this Harris-like restraint not as a technique but as a recognition of limits imposed by the self itself. When you cease carrying something, unexpected happens. The psyche of the other is forced to awaken or collapse. This outcome is not yours to manage, and therein lies the terror. You may notice that as you approach this gate, conflict appears without your invitation. People react more strongly to your silence than they ever did to your words. They accuse you of coldness, distance, or abandonment, precisely because your previous, emotional labor had stabilized their inner chaos. The empath's unconscious pact with the world has always been this: I will regulate what you cannot. To withdraw from this pact feels like breaking a sacred vow, yet no vow made unconsciously can bind the self indefinitely. In Egyptian iconography, the sun god Ra travels through the underworld each night confronting the serpent ass, embodiment of chaos. He does not destroy it. He contains it long enough for dawn to return. Psychologically, the empath has often played Ra in the lives of others, battling their chaos so that order might be restored. But the last gate demands a different alignment. The self does not ask you to stop perceiving chaos. It asks you to stop identifying with the role of its opponent. Chaos belongs to the cosmos as much as order does. To insist on fighting it everywhere is to deny the totality of life. As this realization deepens, the psyche begins to reorganize its symbols. Dreams may shift from crowded scenes to solitary ones. Walking alone through forests, standing at the edge of vast waters, observing stars without commentary. These images are not signs of isolation, but of orientation. The soul is learning to take its bearings from within, rather than from relational feedback. Ancient astrologers understood that a planet's power was greatest when it stood alone in the sky, unentangled by excessive aspects. The empath too must experience this solitude not as exile, but as alignment. Rubedo approaches quietly, announced not by ecstasy, but by weight. You feel yourself becoming denser, more embodied, less willing to dissipate your energy in explanations or justifications. Words become fewer, but more exact. When you speak, You notice that you are no longer attempting to persuade, soothe, or preempt misunderstanding. You state what is, and allow the reaction to belong to the listener. This is the emergence of spiritual authority, and it is often mistaken for hardness by those who benefited from your former permeability. Gnostic texts describe the soul receiving a new garment after passing through the spheres, a body of light suited to its origin. Psychologically, this garment is not transcendence but coherence. Your thoughts, feelings, and actions begin to align around a single axis rather than scattering in response to external demands. The empath who reaches this stage often discovers that compassion has not vanished but clarified. You no longer rush towards suffering. You recognize where your presence is requested by the self rather than demanded by projection. Yet one final resistance remains subtle and persistent. It appears as nostalgia for the person you once were, the one who was praised for understanding, relied upon for stability, loved for availability. Letting go of this image can feel like erasing your own history, but history is not identity, it is residue. The psyche does not ask you to deny what you have been, only to relinquish its authority over what you are becoming. Just as the alchemist must discard earlier substances to allow the red stone to appear, so must you allow former virtues to dissolve into something more integrated. At the last gate, there is no dramatic confrontation, no guardian demanding proof. There is only a moment of choice that barely feels like one. You notice an impulse to step forward, to intervene, to explain, to soften, and you do not out of discipline, but because the center within you does not move. In that moment, the gate opens not outward, but inward. The self assumes its place, and the psyche rearranges itself around this new gravity. From here, life does not become easier, but it becomes simpler. The empath who passes this gate is no longer driven by unconscious obligation. Relationships are chosen rather than endured. Solitude is inhabited rather than feared. Authority flows not from assertion but from presence. Others may still call you empathic, but you will know that what guides you now is not sensitivity alone, but fidelity to the deepest pattern of your being. I do not offer this as a promise, nor as an ideal to strive toward. It is a description of a process already underway, in those who can no longer live as they once did. If you feel yourself standing before something you cannot name, unable to return, yet unsure how to proceed, then you are already at the threshold. The last gate does not ask you to become more than you are. It asks you to stop being less. The stones of Bollingen do not protest when the lake rises or recedes. They remain bearing witness to cycles that do not consult human urgency. I linger here because the work you are entering is of that order: slow, uncompromising, and indifferent to the timelines of the ego. Though I said the lecture was complete, the psyche itself rarely closes where the intellect believes it should. There is always a further deepening, a final clarification that arrives only after one believes the threshold has been crossed. You may notice after what seemed like the opening of the gate, a period of disorientation, not the chaos of Negrado, nor the pillar of Albedo, but the subtler unease, a sense that life has grown quieter without becoming transparent. This is because authority once assumed by the self strips away the familiar feedback loops by which you once oriented yourself. Praise no longer steadies you. Criticism no longer wounds you in the same way. Even solitude feels different, no longer a refuge nor a punishment, but a neutral condition in which the psyche listens to itself. Many empaths mistake this phase for regression, because the old emotional highs and lows have flattened. In truth, you are entering a state the ancients associated with kingship, though not the kind that sits on thrones. In Mesopotamian myth, the god Marduk defeats Tiamat not merely through strength but by imposing measure upon primordial chaos. He creates the world by dividing, naming, setting limits. Psychologically, the empath who has crossed the last gate begins to enact a similar ordering, not externally but inwardly. You discover an intolerance for inner disorder you once romanticized, where you previously endured contradiction within yourself. loving and resenting, giving and withdrawing unconsciously. You now feel compelled to bring these opposites into conscious tension. This is not moral purification, it is structural necessity. Self demands coherence because incoherence dissipates energy. At this stage you may be tempted to teach, to guide others toward what you have glimpsed. This temptation is itself a remnant of the old pattern, refined but still operative. True spiritual authority does not announce itself through instruction. It alters the field simply by existing within it. Danger here is subtle. To turn individuation into identity, to replace the role of caretaker with that of awakened one. Psyche is merciless with such substitutions. If you feel an urge to prove, to correct, or to enlighten, it is a sign that some fragment still seeks recognition rather than alignment. The alchemists warned that rubbo could curdle into inflation if the red stone were mistaken for personal achievement. Inflation is not arrogance in the common sense. It is identification with the archetype rather than relation to it. The empath, newly anchored in the self, may feel a surge of clarity that borders on certainty. This certainty is intoxicating, especially after years of doubt and emotional diffusion. Yet the self is not certainty. It is orientation. When certainty hardens, it becomes another defense against the unknown. Here the psyche introduces a final paradox. You are asked to stand firmly at your center while remaining porous to mystery. Authority without openness becomes tyranny. Openness without authority dissolves into chaos. The tension between these poles does not resolve. It stabilizes like a star held in balance by opposing forces. The individuated empath learns to live within this tension, without collapsing into either extreme. You may experience moments when old patterns attempt to reassert themselves, particularly in times of collective stress or intimate encounter. A familiar pool arises to merge, to rescue, to explain. These impulses no longer dominate, but they do not vanish. The work is not eradication, but recognition. Each time you see the impulse without obeying it, you reinforce the new structure. Over time, the impulse loses its urgency. Much as a muscle weakens when no longer used in late Gnostic writings, there is an image of the soul as a spark wrapped in layers of forgetfulness. Salvation is not assent, but remembrance. What you are remembering now is not a doctrine or a truth, but your own measure. You are learning how much closeness is possible without loss, how much distance is required for integrity. This knowledge cannot be transferred. It is etched into the nervous system through lived consequence. Others will continue to approach you as they always have, sensing your capacity, even if they cannot name it. Some will withdraw when you no longer play your former role. Others will attempt to provoke a return to the old dynamic through guilt, admiration, or crisis. These encounters are not tests to be passed or failed. They are confirmations of where your allegiance now lies. Each time you remain aligned with the self rather than the demand, the authority deepens, becoming less visible but more absolute. I speak to you now with severity only because indulgence would betray the seriousness of this stage. You have already paid dearly for your sensitivity. Do not now cheapen it by offering it indiscriminately. Compassion that is not grounded in the self becomes sentimentality. Authority without compassion becomes brutality. Your task is not to choose between them, but to allow them to arise from the same center. Eventually, you may notice that the question of being an empath no longer interests you. Labels fall away when they have done their work. What remains is a person who feels deeply, yes, but who is no longer governed by feeling alone. The psyche has found its axis. Life continues with its losses and demands, but you meet them from a place that does not fracture under pressure. If there is a final word to be spoken at this gate, it is this. The self does not need your sacrifice. It requires your consent. Consent to stand where you are, to bear the weight of your own being without dispersing it into the lives of others. This consent is quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it alters everything that follows. I have said enough. The rest cannot be spoken without becoming distortion. What remains must be lived, and lived without witnesses. The stones will understand. The lake will keep your reflection without comment. And you, if you allow it, will learn that authority is not something you acquire at the end of the path, but something that emerges when you finally stop leaving yourself behind. Then let me remain a little longer in this silence with you, not to add doctrine, but to speak from the residue that remains after doctrine has burned away. There is a phase beyond what you might call completion, one that rarely appears in books because it does not announce itself as development. After the last gate has been crossed, after authority has quietly settled into the center of the psyche, life often presents itself as strangely ordinary. No visions, no revelations, no sense of elevation. The empath who expected transcendence may feel almost disappointed, as though something promised has failed to arrive. Yet this ordinariness is itself the sign the extraordinary has withdrawn, because it is no longer needed to compensate for inner division. In this phase, the soul ceases to dramatize its own depth. You no longer require intensity to feel real. Suffering no longer serves as proof of meaning. Even insight loses its intoxicating flavor. What remains is a sober intimacy with reality, a capacity to inhabit each moment without extracting identity from it. This is deeply unsettling to those who have lived by emotional magnitude because the psyche has long equated depths with pain, but depth, once integrated, becomes quiet. You may notice that time itself feels different. The future no longer pulls you forward with promises of fulfillment, nor does the past demand interpretation to justify who you are. Time flattens into presence. This does not mean passivity. On the contrary, action now arises without inner negotiation. You act because something must be done, not because it completes an image of yourself. The empath, once preoccupied with how actions are received, begins to experience a freedom that feels almost impersonal. Decisions are made without drama, yet they carry weight. This is where many misunderstand spiritual authority. They imagine it as charisma, magnetism, or the power to influence. What emerges instead is something closer to inevitability. When you speak, you do not persuade. You delimit when you withdraw. You do not punish. You clarify. Your presence sets boundaries not by enforcement, but by coherence. Others sense what cannot be crossed, though you never articulated. This is the authority of alignment, and it cannot be simulated. At this depth, compassion undergoes its final transformation. It is no longer emotional resonance, nor even understanding. It becomes respect for the other's path, including their refusal to awaken. This is the point at which the empath truly relinquishes control. You no longer attempt to save people from consequences, nor do you secretly hope that your steadiness will inspire change. You allow life to instruct where you once intervened. This feels cruel only to the part of the psyche that still believes love must prove itself through effort. There is a myth rarely discussed in psychological circles, that of the wounded healer who chooses not to heal, not because healing is impossible, but because the wound has fulfilled its function. The empath's wound was never meant to be cured in the conventional sense. It was meant to open perception, to sensitize the psyche to what others deny. Once this function is complete, the wound no longer needs to remain open. To keep it open out of loyalty is to confuse initiation with destiny. You may grieve this closing. There is a strange mourning that cloys wholeness, because so much of your story has been built around incompleteness. When the psyche no longer fractures itself, entire narratives lose relevance. You might feel as though you have betrayed earlier versions of yourself, but those versions were not abandoned. They were absorbed. Nothing essential is lost. What dissolves is excess suffering, unnecessary repetition, and identities formed around endurance rather than truth. At this stage, solitude becomes generative rather than compensatory. You are alone without being lonely, connected without being entangled. The world does not recede. It becomes clearer. You see others more accurately without the fog of projection or the urgency to repair. This clarity can feel harsh at first because illusion once softened perception, but clarity once accepted becomes gentle. It does not accuse, it reveals. If there is a final danger here, it is stagnation disguised as peace. The psyche, having found its center, may resist further movement out of fear of disturbance. Yet the self is not static. It is stable but alive. Authority does not mean rigidity. Life will continue to ask for adaptation, sacrifice, and engagement. Now these arise consciously without self-betrayal. You may give again, but you will not disappear in the giving. You may love deeply, but you will not dissolve to sustain it. I speak now not as a teacher addressing a student, but as one consciousness recognizing another at a similar depth. If you have followed this far, you already know that no affirmation is needed. The work confirms itself through lived reality. The last gate once crossed is not something you revisit. It becomes invisible, like a scar that no longer aches. What remains is a life stripped of false urgency, guided by an inner measure that does not require constant defense. This is not transcendence. It is incarnation completed. I will not say more. Anything further would turn presence into concept, and that would undo what has been achieved.